You're tuned into 9 to 5 Work Rebels with your host, Ebony Gale. This series is sponsored by the PRCA's Race and Ethnicity Equity Board. To learn more about REEB and its mentoring scheme, visit prca.org.uk/REEB.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Gems in Comms series special, brought to you by 9 to 5 Work Rebels. I am your host, Ebony Gale, and today I'm really excited to be speaking with the lovely Ella Darlington, who is Head of Comms and Marketing at Creative Access, about her journey into PR, marketing and communications. For those of you who don't know, Creative Access does provide access to creative industries for underrepresented groups, which is really, really, really cool. So welcome, Ella.
Hi, I'm so excited to be on. I'm really honoured as well. Thank you for inviting me.
You are most welcome. I've been wanting to get you on here anyway, so let's get into it. So as I always like to say at the beginning, this podcast essentially is about giving you your flowers and giving people of colour their flowers who've carved out a really great career for themselves within the comms and PR marketing industry, okay? Because it's not an easy thing to do. We all know that it is a majority white industry, ranging between sort of, some say it's 89, some say it's 92. It kind of ranges between that. So again, well done to you, and kudos to you essentially. So of course, we always like to get into starting off by talking about you. So can you tell us about yourself and what you do, and also have you always wanted to work in kind of communications?
Ooh, interesting question. So a brief bit about me. I'm a East London girl, born and bred. So I think, interestingly, and comparatively with a lot of other people, like I've been able to rely on, being in my family home when I was establishing myself in the industry, because it's so London centric.
Yeah.
Whereas, I think sometimes that can be an issue, and an issue entry point wise for other people who are wanting to break into the space and maybe self-limiting themselves. But grounded myself in journalism. I was just really intrigued by it and motivated by my teachers. I thought one of my teachers, who was a speechwriter for Tony Blair and like had articles in the Observer, was like the coolest person in the world. So I was like, yeah, I really want to do journalism. Trained in that, worked in magazine for a little bit. I sort of like had short assistant stints at like Bauer Media and Square Mile magazine and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I, luckily, when I had sort of done internships, had done one at the Wall Street Journal Europe, and it was in a press office role. So I got some sort of insight into exactly what comms was, because I think, had that not happened, it may have felt quite foreign to me. Like the whole concept of anything to do with public relations or marketing or comms. If you don't know, if you don't know, you don't know. But was lucky that I had that touch point, and I am the kind of person where I'm really nosy, I'm really personable. I love to network, and that was even more so me in my early 20s.
Yeah.
So I would make the point of always going back to the Wall Street Journal and reminding them that I was still alive, and that who I was, and that I had a great time there. And a job opportunity came up around, and it was just for 3 months. And then they kept I eventually got the job. It was quite difficult competition, but got the job. And then they extended it up until a year. And then I, after that point, had a series of experiences at all different sorts of sizes and makeups of comms agencies, all different sorts of disciplines. So I really got to figure out what intrigued me, what I was good and what I was not good at.
Right.
And I think ultimately what made me decide to make the shift from journalism to comms was money. Whenever anyone young asks me that, I'm just super like transparent.
Yeah.
That the capacity to earn and be independent was really important to me. So that was a big motivation. And yeah, cut to, I guess, over a decade, almost 12 years later, at various different comms agencies, which included things like or brands like I worked for Ketchum for a while, met some amazing people, got to work on amazing campaigns and travel a bit. Also worked for an independent agency which specialized in B2B tech called Octopus Group. They got bought by Publicis Group and then they became what is now Publicis Pro. So got to experience lots of different designs of agencies as well, like independent and then joining forces with like a bigger agency and what that means and
Yeah.
where you fit into everything and
Yeah.
how you can still be a person of value. And then fortuitously, I had a mentor through the amazing BME PR Pros mentorship scheme in 2019. Risha Ranjani, she's the commercial director at Golan, and she worked with another comms pro who's quite well known in the industry, Bibby Hilton. And Bibby, I think, was obviously aware of me through Risha and just said, look, I'm looking for someone. I don't know if it's you, don't know if it's someone that you know. And we, had a conversation and then I, formally interviewed for the job up against others and got the job. And that's me at Creative Access now. But it came at a time in my life as well where I was connected to a career coach, Zarina Charles, who is incredible, through the UK Black Comms Network. And she was getting to, and this was before Creative Access, but she was getting me to ask all these introspective questions about what motivated me and what was important to me. And it led me to really unexpected places. It led me to conclude that I was actually motivated by working for somewhere that was purpose-led.
Yeah.
And then this conversation with somebody happened in connection to Creative Access. So it was just like really weird, fortuitous timing. It just kind of happened.
It all lined up. Alignment, I call it. That was all in alignment. And it makes sense because, purpose work, I feel like is so important. And I get why you would end up there. And, it's great that you and Bibi had that talk. I know Bibi for Women in PR. We both sat on the board there and she was the president at the time. So, that all makes sense. And it's wonderful to hear that as well. Do you know what I mean? Like the mentors and the BME PR pros and how that all came together. That's really, really interesting. Really, really interesting. And so you started out wanting to do journalism and then kind of fell into comms by the sounds of it and stuck with it because of the money motivation as well.
Yep.
And would you say, was that what exactly attracted you to industry? Was it the fact that, you could, impact narrative and, what made you think, okay, I like journalism, but I'm jumping here because besides the money, like what else was it?
I think great question. Like the practice of journalism is like honing your craft and potentially knowing nothing about a subject, educating yourself enough to be able to then storytell. And I find that directly applies to comms so neatly because especially I spent probably the most amount of years over the last sort of like 12, 13 in tech, both consumer and business, B2B tech. So have come at it from a bunch of different angles. And me not having studied in a tech background, it meant that I had to educate myself and be curious and ask questions and like go on fact-finding missions with clients. And that was again like flexing these muscles of like that kind of like journalistic nous for a story or what's of interest. Because very often would be the case with tech clients is there is not a clear story. It might be a product launch or it might be a service launch, which, yes, there's, trade press out there that, is supposed to cover that kind of thing. But that's not a guarantee that you're going to get column inches around something. So it then becomes about news generation and sniffing out a story. So that could be attached to people at an organization.
Exactly that.
So I think that's the neat fit for me and why it flexed those skills that I'd spent, that uni time and just after really honing, because I was a terrible journalist when I started. When I first started studying, I was awful. So it's like it's a craft, like you have to work at it.
You have to work at it.
And I'm still getting better.
I feel like life is about improvement, you know, like you're not going to just come out come out like, yeah, I'm just like this banging journalist. It's going to take time, right? You've got to craft it. And even when I think about when I used to sit with journalists at different times and their note taking, like I used to work in regulation quite a lot. So for example, you'd have journalists come down and well, they're covering like a high profile fitness practice case with a doctor or something like that. And I'd look over at their notes and they just got all their shorthand. I'd be like, now that is a skill, okay? Because
I've got my T-line shorthand. I still like note taking T-line,
Yeah, it's really cool. It's really cool. And I think that's what I think that's nice for transferring to comms. So like, you know, bringing things like that, I think is also important. And people don't always think about that. But yeah, in terms of like crafting out and sticking out the story, that is definitely something that meshes together, right? Without us, without businesses, and you know, they feed each other, right? So I think it's really interesting when I speak to people like yourself who've made that transition from journalism to comms. And I feel like that's why most of us have a certain respect for each other, right? You know, as in, you know, journalists to comms and comms to journalism. But I do know that some journalists do get a bit with PRs because of the ones that don't do the research and, you know, just send them wild releases. So I get that. Anyway, moving forward, okay, I want to touch on your life experiences in the industry itself, but starting from childhood. So I always ask this question, which is, when did you become aware of your ethnicity? And that's not to say you don't know the skin you're born in. Like I knew I was a Black girl, but it's in terms of, you know, when your world meets the outside world, and it might be something that is more startling. Like for me, it was going off to secondary school, being the, you know, first year, whatever they call it, yes, the year 7 now they call it, okay. It's been called first year back in the day. I was going off 11 years old and then hearing about Chelsea Smilers and essentially their racist white thugs who used to go around with razors, and if they saw a black or brown some person, they would take a razor and cut across their face. So I remember hearing about that and heading off to school into an area that was quite notoriously at the time a bit racist. So being a bit more like, wow, like, you know, I had heard of different things, and obviously I'm a Black girl living in my world, but wasn't necessarily open to that, or it wasn't necessarily on my peripheral, is what I should say. You know, it was one of those things where it was like, okay, obviously we knew about Mississippi Burning. I've seen certain things, we've heard about things, but this is now something that's crashed into my world. So yeah, that's when I became more aware of, okay, out here, someone could just try and attack me because of my beautiful melanated skin. What was your moment, or have you had that kind of moment?
Yeah, I think probably school days, if I'm honest. And it's more, you know, like we will have had conversations in my family home. Nothing was really off limits. I, you know, come from a family where my mum's English and Irish heritage and my dad's Guyanese heritage. And like all of that was celebrated. So it wasn't, I don't think it stemmed from there if we're talking about awareness. And I think often when we talk about awareness, we sometimes talk about like when it potentially became a source of conflict or when you experienced any conflict.
Yeah.
And so that absolutely didn't happen in the home, but they were really open and transparent with, you know, the difficulties and the friction that they faced when they got together. That was in the 70s and 80s in London. And they'd lost friends over it. People would say to my, you know, people that my mum thought were friends of hers were saying, you know, we thought you were a nice girl. And, you know, they celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary a couple of weeks ago. So
amazing.
From really, really normal families. And I always say normal because, you know, like from a place of neutrality, like being accepting of and encouraging and interested and curious in different cultures, for me is normal. But as I say, I think the point of friction, or the point of where I was made to be aware that there was any kind of difference to be experienced, was probably at school, where people would often ask the question, do you feel more Black or more white? And that question would always stump me because I didn't really understand like what the question was about, or like what it was getting at, or what they were expecting me to say in response, and like what they were capturing in those two different pools. And then I think, yeah, the only place, interestingly, that I've experienced aggressive or verbal racist language, interestingly, has been Essex.
Oh,
Um, and that's just, out and about. That was in teenage years. I met a lot of my friends that I grew up with through dance. I was, in a dance group that a dance group slash youth group from the ages of like 14 to 19, of which I'm now a trustee and advisor for. Just celebrated, I think 20 years.
excellent.
Yeah, and it's amazing. It's called Barking and Dagenham Youth Dance, and the woman who founded it is like a pillar of the community,
Yeah.
Georgina Alexiou. And yeah, we were kind of like all together on a bus, enjoying life and not a care in the world and excited about, what we'd just been rehearsing. And then somebody, threw monkey out there and the N word. And that was my first experience of being confronted what my parents probably experienced to a much greater extent.
Hmm.
Yeah, so that was probably first instances.
Yeah. How old would you say you was at that time?
That would have been 14 on the bus, and then younger, sort of like year 7 or, first year age at
Yeah.
school. People are trying to ask me to describe, what I identify more with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. I think it's interesting. A lot of the people that I've interviewed on this podcast have identified school or even primary school, has some people identified primary schools. Really interesting because obviously, kids are soaking up what they learn from and then come and spew it out at us. So I think that's interesting and very interesting that you mentioned having to feel like, what side do you belong to, when you're mixed. So it's like, you belong to both essentially.
Yeah.
So really must have been a lot as well to deal with growing up, I suppose. Absolutely. And do you feel like, your race, ethnicity has ever held you back within your career?
It's such a hard one to quantify. I think, organizations like, we as an organization, that we operate in connecting, as you said, underrepresented folks with opportunities in the creative industries. And we also go, and look into some of the subgroups that we advocate for and really interrogate barriers that people face.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I think what can be difficult for people who are from the global minority to understand or to comprehend is sometimes, believing what the global majority say, because that's only how you can quantify it in terms of whether you feel like you've been um, held back or not given the opportunity for something, unless it becomes a legal matter, and then that's much more inarguable. But I think personally, um, it's more been about how I how I make people feel like they can relate to me. So like expending probably more energy than somebody who might be from the global minority would on, finding connective points with people and convincing people that you know, I can relate to them, I
Mm-hmm.
can be trusted in a client scenario, or I can be trusted in a new business scenario.
Yeah.
Um, to lead a conversation. There's relatability between me and a client. I remember, you know, being a couple of things that pop up for me. One is more to do with a class thing, interestingly enough. And
Mm.
interestingly, I think my mum would say that maybe we come from a working class background, but I think arguably when I interrogate it, we're probably more like middle class,
Mm-hmm.
um, because my parents worked really, really hard. And I just remember one comment that I came up against when I was interviewing for a role, and I really wanted to work on this particular brand, and I had knowledge of it. I'd gone to uni, where the brand was based. I bought a lot of their product, and so I spoke about that extensively in my interview. And then when it came to assigning the accounts, I was told when I got the job, I was like, "Yeah, you'll be working on that account. You showed so much
Yeah.
passion for it." And then one of my directors in the business just decided that one of my colleagues who was upper class was going to be on that account. And, I kind of let that go. And then there was another occasion where they said, can you, go and talk posh to the client because we needed to like get some repeat business out of them, and you know to try, get repeat business out of them, and fact find some things, and placate them. And so it was this term used, like go and talk posh to them. And I knew exactly what that meant, because there was nobody that looked like me who that phrase would have been associated with, or would have been encouraged to do. And those words like carry some other meanings as well.
Absolutely.
Because the person who was being put on the account and being encouraged to go and talk posh to the clients was from the global minority. And other occasions where, it's people assuming that my parents aren't still together, and, asking me directly and being surprised when I say, yeah, my parents are still together. Because then that's another common misconception that I've come up against a lot. People assuming that because I'm from dual heritage, that it couldn't have worked out, and that kind of thing doesn't work out. So again, it's more
it's like micro. Nuances, isn't it? It's micro. It's all the nuances.
Yes, it's micro, and it's and things like bosses saying, "Oh, I really like your hair that way," and it's straight, and it's like with a slight wave, and it's palatable. Mm-hmm. But what comes, I think, interestingly, when we've also looked into research to do with like the PR and comms industry, which we have, and I think organizations like UK Black Comms Network are really great for doing that as well, like looking into the nuance in people's experiences, is also that, I've spent a lot of time talking about what appear to be microaggressions, but in an environment where it's a service model and you're selling people or you're selling individuals, especially in an agency environment, that becomes a macro issue, because it becomes about how you're perceived or labeled within an organization. And my pet hate is when, like I had a boss who was really incompetent, and he was actually let go from the business. But he would often say, "Oh, you're coming across as a bit aggressive," like in meetings in front of the team.
Oh, wow.
And I just hated that he was trying to embed that as part of my perception or part of my image.
Yeah.
Because said to perhaps like a male from the global minority, that would be seen as a power move. That would be seen as an advantage. But replace that with someone who looks like me, or, any shade that's like slightly up or slightly down from me. And you like, that can be dangerous. That can be the reason why you don't get invited to pitch for new business.
Exactly.
And you have no idea like what that new client's going to be worth, and like the value that's going to be to the company. So like everything is weighted in your value and your perception. So that micro words like that in an industry like ours are hugely impactful, and you become acutely aware of that the more experience that you gain.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I agree. And what's interesting is, like you said, a lot of it is microaggressions, but in that sort of environment, it can feel a lot, particularly if you're the one person in that team, that feels like a huge weight on your shoulder. And to be given things like, aggressive, and we know that there's a whole angry black man, angry black woman tropes that are around. So it's really unhelpful. So I completely get where you're coming from. Good that boss, your boss that seemed to be completely incompetent, was able to be let go. I'm sure it's got nothing to do with your situation, but at least they caught onto his nonsense. But that's really difficult, particularly when you've got someone who's senior, and you're not always going to feel comfortable to push back on that type of rhetoric. So that's a good example. Thanks for sharing that, and for sharing your experience as a child as well. Moving forward slightly, have you experienced, or would you say you've witnessed racism in the workplace before? And if so, how was it handled? Like, an example that I had was when I did work for the doctors regulator, GMC, and I remember being in the press office and getting a call from a doctor, because at that point we had press calls, but also helped doctors with some of their calls as well, some of the public side of things. And this was a doctor that had retired. You could tell, he's a rich old white man. He was on the phone to me asking me for some help. I helped him. He was really grateful. And then he was like, "Oh, what's your name?" I said, "It's Ebony." And the man was absolutely astounded. He said, "Oh my God, are you collared?" you're so well spoken. Like, I would never have gathered that you were colored. Wow. Like, I was just like, no, for one, I'm black. I don't turn pink and purple. I'm black. And, I was also taken aback by well, you're well spoken. Do you know what I mean? So these things can happen, it happens. There's other examples that I could give, but this is one of the ones that always sticks out in my mind because I remember being on the phone and seeing my boss look at me and thinking like, "Are you all right?" And they came up to me afterwards. I was like, "Oh my God, I can't believe that happened to you." But have you experienced or seen anything in the workplace like that? I suppose you experienced the aggression, the microaggression. That's one thing I would say.
Yeah, I think it's more for me, it's more like it can be a lonely space if there aren't people that look like you. And I know that phrase has been uttered a lot, and I don't want that to lose impact or lose value. And like to expand on it, if you, as quite rightly as you said, if you are the only person who optically represents, people of color or black people or brown
Majority,
people,
or yeah,
because ultimately you will get grouped.
yeah,
You will be a representative of all those people. It's like going back to a phrase that Akala said. He's like, just because a high percentage of pedophiles tend to be older white men, it's not to say that we assume that all older white men are pedophiles, but apply, insert whatever towards global majority, and we often get profiled or grouped. And what that then means is that you then become a representative of what you look like, and it's, walking a bit of a tightrope. But I think to come back to your point about was it more around like the microaggression piece, or
just whether you've witnessed any type of racism or work in the workplace. It could be microaggression. It could be something that you might have seen that might not happen to you, but you might have witnessed it to somebody else. And how it was handled, I suppose, is what I'm kind of going for.
yeah, it's more so I've had the whole eloquent thing, yes.
Yeah.
I've also had people I think that a common one is often people will compliment me on my name, like, "Oh, Ella Darlington is such a beautiful name." And I agree. I think it's lovely.
Yeah.
But they're not ready for where the conversation's going to go, and where, the only way I know how to answer it, which is, where does it come from? And I'm like, slavery.
Yeah.
And a reaction that I had from an old boss was, "Oh, I was just asking a question, didn't realize you were going to take it there." And
Fact. It's not taking it anywhere. It's just a fact,
it's answering a question,
Yeah.
and it's, often people don't want to be confronted with that, or, they don't want to have that conversation because it's uncomfortable. And I think that's often what it is. It's, I think for a long time, or for my formative years in comms, people felt really comfortable to say exactly whatever they wanted to say without empathy or without putting themselves in that person's shoes. I think now, hopefully, slowly but surely, little by little, person by person, the tides are changing, and people are starting to have the ability to be more empathetic. But I was having a conversation with somebody yesterday who was putting a panel together for Black History Month. And I was just saying that increasingly working in this industry, which is, in the not-for-profit space, I'm under an organization that specializes in diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I never have before. So I'm still learning stuff. But what I'm become increasingly aware of is the fact that there will be some people's hearts and minds that you will never change, and you have to be okay with that.
Yeah.
And it's just, you just have to keep moving through life with that in mind. And also knowing that, yes, you will be grouped, yes, you will be profiled, you will also come up against some people who will be champions of yours. And I don't want it to be like a total dampener, like that's the only experience that I've had, of people coming up against like frictious moments where, it's only microaggressions. I've also had people, bosses of mine, after George Floyd was attacked, which again, I can imagine has been mentioned a lot because it was such a shocking moment for the year, for the years and the reality that we're in currently, to be confronted with something a murder that could have been enacted so brazenly,
Mm.
and casually. But I had a phone call from one of my bosses who was on the board at the agency that I was working at. And, you know, he wasn't encouraging me or forcing me to talk. And it was just a check-in because also everything was under a microscope because we were so separate because of lockdown.
Mm.
I will never forget that phone call. I will always be so encouraged and um, remember that compassion and that connection, and that person's still a friend of mine to this day. So as much as there is like darkness and microaggressions and racial stuff that you're confronted with, especially also client side as well. Like I had a client tell a story at a lunch. Like we were at a really nice lunch at a nice restaurant in St.
Mm.
Paul, and she was it was a client who had a lot of control and power over our balance sheet.
Mm.
And she was talking about a scenario where her boyfriend that she'd started dating was of South African heritage. He was from the global minority, and he held the opinion that Black people were a lower class citizen. And it was almost like she wasn't mentioning it as an education piece. It was almost like in jest, as
Yeah.
though it was something to be laughed at.
Yeah.
And it just wasn't spoken about with much empathy or care. And I just remember, I was there with one of my team. I was the most senior person representing my agency. And even my team, who was again a person from the global minority, kind of side glanced at me like, is she really saying what she's saying right now?
Mm.
So it can come from anywhere, and
It
sometimes you just
can.
have to like sit with it, swallow it, and just accept that some people's hearts and minds you ain't gonna change, and you've got to be okay with that.
I think that's something that people of color live with as and are just it's just normal for us. So I feel like as a person of color, you have to operate through life with that in mind. Because look at history has shown you that there's some people who you're not going to have to move. You're going to have some who are for you, and there's some that are not going to be for you. So absolutely, I agree with you definitely. So would you say there's been a time where you had wished you spoke up about something, or where there's a time when you did speak up and self advocate in the workplace? I suppose in that example, maybe with that client, you might look back at that and think, oh, I wish I was able to say something to her about what she said then. Do you know what I mean? But in those situations, because you know that they're a client that's got a big amount of money they're coming with, you don't want to ruffle any feathers. Like that's just one thing that springs to mind. It could be a completely different situation where you may have seen something and thought, maybe I could have said something or maybe not. Because as we grow within the industry, the hope is that we also become a little bit more vocal, because you're just coming into it. You're not always going to be comfortable. Not everyone's comfortable to speak up anyway. Like
Right.
everyone's got their own, feelings about things, and you don't have to. But I'm just wondering, has there been a time when you think, oh my gosh, I wish I had spoken up about something, or I wish I did self advocate?
I think what you've said about when you gain in experience and I guess influence, you have more you've got more reference points with how things go and how things are
Yeah,
received,
yeah,
especially because you've observed things, whether it may not be racial, it may be, gender-based discrimination or whatever. You get to see more and more examples of how when somebody raises something, how that's received. So for me, it has always been a case of pick your battles.
yeah,
And I think very early on, it was always a case of just keep your head down. Like, it's really, it's not worth it. When you have experienced an ism,
mm,
and you can feel that and you carry that with you. And then, you kind of get a sense of like who people are, the more
yeah,
that you experience. But yeah, I think probably when I was in my early to mid 20s, I probably would never have had the confidence to raise something in a work environment, because I would be terrified with, again, like your value is it's so much in your perception.
yeah,
And if you alter that yourself, even if you feel like it's the right thing to do, if you alter that, you're reminded with those examples that you've seen of, how you can fall out of favor. And there is so much favoritism in our
mm,
industry,
absolutely agree.
which can be really, really, really damaging.
Yeah,
Um, and raising something can change your perception from being someone who's high performing to, yes, someone's high performing, but they're also like, what now overtakes them is that they're problematic.
Yeah.
They've got to be in their bonnet.
Yeah.
They're not a team player.
Mm.
They're not the right fit. All of those sorts of like trappings and phrases. I think so. I mean, to your question of, is there a moment where I think I should have said something? There were moments where I did say something where it was just sort of like a conversation in the kitchen where I was among peers.
Yeah.
But when it was more senior people or client side, I really had to pick my battles. But I think there's nothing that sticks in my mind where I feel like, do you know what, I really should have said something and raised the flag there, because I think sadly I probably would have experienced the negative repercussions of it. And I think that is sad.
That is, but that's also why I raised this question, because I feel like it's not like I'm not trying to pick at you or anybody that's going through this. It's to highlight the fact that actually sometimes you don't feel empowered to do that. And the repercussions from that are also quite extensive. People have got bills to pay and things that are, that they're dealing with. So, getting up as a person of color is a fight in itself, because you have to sort of put on a bit of an armor, prepare yourself potentially for what might be coming your way, but to also have to push back in the workplace. It's difficult. And like you said, sometimes you just don't know. And if you're young and you're going through these sort of things, it's even more difficult, to navigate. And I think that's okay. That's okay to say that. And I think that's part of why I have this platform too, which is to show that actually, sometimes there are times where you're just not empowered. You're not going to feel to do that. So when you've got employers saying, oh, well, why wasn't this brought up? Or why don't people talk about these sort of things? Well, because they don't always feel empowered, because sometimes there is a ricochet effect and nobody wants to get the backlash of, oh, well, you're a problem person or you're this person, So I think that's important that we also look at that. And
when it's been really powerful though, and I would extend this to as a piece of advice to anyone listening who is from the global minority, there is so much power in spotting and saying something that you've observed, and there can be numerous ways that you can tackle that. We offer a training that's about being an inclusive line manager. And I sat through it myself, and it completely altered my perception of then how I perceive people in interview scenarios, how I advocate for my team. And, I've always been, when I've had the power to do so, advocated for my team in my more recent years. But there's so much power if people from the global minority, and if anyone's unfamiliar with that phrase, global minority typically means white people, and global majority refers to Black, Asian, Indigenous, and all of the other groups that kind of get attached alongside it. Often it's referred to as ethnically diverse, but that global majority populace. If you are from that global minority group, then there's huge power in like seeing and speaking and calling stuff out. And it doesn't have to be a big like escalation HR scenario. It could literally just be speaking to the person who may have been the offender and just educating them and making sure it doesn't happen again, or just making sure that there's sensitivity there.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. I agree with that. Now, moving on a little bit into code switching. Do you feel like people of colour, so global majority people, do you feel like they can lead with their authentic voices in the workplace, or will we be forever code switching, particularly in the Western world I'm talking about?
Again, it's so interesting, like having like the inside track, because we did a piece of research around accent bias, and we also did a piece of research around hair and clothing, which again, like those are not all of the characteristics that make up your code or like make up you as an individual or your culture, but they're like external perception factors, aren't they? I think on the topic of and insights from both of those pieces of research were that when you look at intersectionality, all of the feelings of barriers or otherisms were like exacerbated, like exponentially. So like
Yeah.
if you're, you know, both Black and disabled, or if you're you know, Black with a working class accent,
Hmm.
your experience is magnified versus if you just had a working class accent and you were from the global minority. So like the hard facts are there, that there is a, you know, there's a perception issue, and there's currency around certain accents and certain perceptions. And I think going through this inclusive line manager training that I went through, one of the huge things was around like inherent bias that we all have.
Hmm.
And the most powerful thing was this idea that within comms there's an ideal, right? Like if you were asked to like picture in your head what previous hiring managers would have in their mind about like ideal candidate, there are probably certain things that come to mind because of who you know have been hired
Hmm.
for the most part. And I think for me, code switching, like I feel like I've been like a chameleon my whole life, because I've
Yeah.
like been dipping into these two really big cultures, like Black culture, white culture. And I almost have this like ability to like in my head know exactly what a white person is thinking that I'm talking to, and exactly what a Black person is thinking that I'm talking to. And obviously there will be nuances. You don't know where people have come from, their background, their political beliefs, their persuasions, all of that sort of stuff. But I'm talking about like in hiring manager positions, or, you know, you meet someone at a networking event and you can exactly make assumptions based on someone's like body language or how they treat you, what their perception is of someone like you. And then you sort of like see their face start to change when this voice comes out of you. And maybe you'll get an observation talking about how eloquent you are or
Hmm.
whatever. And like, this is how I've always spoken. This is how my brother speaks. This is how my mum speaks. This is how my dad speaks. And I would have people say to me, both pre and during working world, you know, why are you acting posh for? Or, you know, why are you posh? This is not even a posh accent. This is not a received pronunciation accent.
I don't feel like your accent is posh. Do you know what I mean?
But for some,
But
but
for
you know
some
what,
people, it's posh.
but for some people it's posh. And, you know, there can be like bigger perceptions of that.
Mm.
You know, from a global minority perspective, that can be, it can be an advantage, because it can be like, okay, we feel comfortable putting you in front of clients. But then also, um, there can be people that don't want you to win. Do you know
Yeah.
what I mean? Or
Yeah.
or that people you make feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I have experienced that as
Yeah.
well. Or, you know, a lot of those people asking me if I felt more Black or more white typically tended to be Black people, or
Mm.
typically tended to be people from the global majority. And I
Yeah.
think they were just trying to figure me out.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really it, it minimizes you, and it minimizes your potential. So I think on the
Mm.
topic of code switching, I don't know, it's almost like redundant, because I feel like for me, I've always spoken the way that I've spoken. I've from my dad's side and my mum's side, we've never been able to leave the house without ironed clothes. We've
Mm.
never been able to, you know, we've never been able to, which I think would probably be a thing from a lot of like Caribbean households, and maybe like Irish households, or like working class households. It's like your visual perception is like is what is the first thing that people take in about you. Um, there will be definitely like slang and phrases and stuff that I throw into conversation with the people that I grew up with,
Mhm.
that I just wouldn't in a work scenario, or in a client sscenario. Like I say, I may say it with my team, but I probably wouldn't say it if I was pitching, like, you know, like things like bruv, or, you
Yeah.
know, I don't know. They're
I
just
get
so
what you mean.
ingrained in,
I get what
you know,
you
that
mean.
I don't even know. But like, you know, I think probably wouldn't inject that into my working world across most of my career I do now with my team to make them feel comfortable, make them feel like they can spread out. But there just probably would be certain scenarios where I wouldn't. But I think definitely been a conscious decision for me in terms of like how I wear my hair. I don't know if that comes under the bracket of code switching. I think it's kind of code switching adjacent. And like feedback that I've had from bosses or like people in control of my my career, I guess, of like what that looks like and what I wear. I'm conscious that if I wear like, or if I love wearing hoops, for example, and like the bigger the better, but I'd be conscious of like, oh, really overthinking like every single aspect of my outfit or like or what I've put together of what the perception someone will have of me. Do they think that I come from a home where my parents aren't together, or I'm the first in my family to go to uni. Yeah, I was. So what? Just preconceptions or assumptions.
This series is sponsored by the PRCA's Race and Ethnicity Equity Board. To learn more about REEB and its mentoring scheme, visit prca.org.uk/REEB.
Because you said about your feedback from your bosses. So that made me think, what, has someone commented on your hair, your appearance? Like, has that happened with you in your situation? Because thinking of my own experiences, no one's ever commented on my hair or not like that. I've had like little things like from colleagues, like, oh, you changed your hair again, that kind of thing. But I've never had anyone tell me how to wear my hair for work or anything about that. So I'm interested to hear that bit.
It's more subtle than that. It's more like positive reinforcement when
like when your hair straight, it's like, oh, your hair looks really nice today.
Yes.
Okay.
So if I were to have my hair, like I can remember the exact like scenarios and like where everyone was sitting when people, and it's I've got no issues with people saying that my hair looks nice. I absolutely love that. But it's more like it's the positive reinforcement where typically when in an agency setting, and it might not be the case now. Things might have like drastically changed. I've not been in an agency environment in 2 years, but I do still work with a lot of agency people as client partners of ours. And there is a more palatable way to present yourself, is what I was, positively reinforced to understand.
Yeah.
And people saying, I really like your hair like that, or like that's your favorite way that you wear that hairstyle is the favorite way that you wear your hair. Like my favorite way that you wear your hair.
Right.
And like what else could I take from that? But
I get
okay, so this is the palatable way, this is the professional way. This is preferred. Especially in an industry that, as I said, is all about perception.
It is. And it's so interesting for what, global majority have to go through in terms of, even you mentioned hoop earrings. I'm like, yeah, I've got my hoops on today. And
not that big, but they're just like
little ones on today. Yeah. But the fact that you still have to think that and be thinking, oh, should I go with my hoops earrings? Because, or stereotypes clearly is what you're kind of alluding to. And it's really fascinating to me because these are the things that we have to go through in sort of everyday life. And I think on the flip side, the white counterpart, when she's getting ready, if she's thinking about, oh, well, I won't have to wear these earrings today because I don't want to be judged, or I can't do this. It's completely different ball game. So yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting one, isn't it? It's interesting. Now, as we're on the topic of bias, when did you become aware of the color bias within our industry, within sort of, PR comms and marketing? Like, when would you become aware? For me, I remember, just navigating my career and became more aware of it when I started to go to industry events, because then it was just like, oh my God, like, and when I got appointed to the Women in PR board as the first Black woman, and going to some of the events, and it just be like a sea of white women. And I was just like, oh my God, like, it really isn't diverse. And obviously then I started looking more into the reports and stuff like that, and I started to see how bad it was. But because I was always I done a lot of in-house roles. So I was in the company where I might be the only Black person within the comms team, maybe one other person. But without the organization, there's Black people. So it didn't feel so odd. Do you know what I mean? And then I started seeing more the agency makeups, and I'd be like, yeah, these are looking slightly odd. I'd look at the agency picture, and, you go to the website and they'd be like, who are we? And look, and I'd be like, spot the Black person. It's getting better now, definitely. But it was something that I definitely became aware of coming to the industry events. many years ago.
I think, yeah, definitely whenever you see like a large percentage of our industry represented, it becomes apparent.
Yeah.
I think also I was, you know, what I understood very early on is that the people that wield the power and have influential positions are typically going to be white individuals. And, if you like the briefest of history lessons, what I, was obviously aware of, which is, the origins of like post-war spin doctors was that it was proximity to Whitehall, proximity to Downing Street.
Mm-hmm.
And, those people had to be university educated. Typically, those are going to be people of the global minority.
Mm-hmm.
And they were typically male. And then it got towards like the Champagne 80s when a lot of people were setting up these boutique comms agencies.
Yeah.
And it was, sometimes using daddy's mummy, it will be an agency named after your family name.
Mm-hmm.
And more women started entering into it. And but again, you would have to have like the revenue and the capital to set something like that up. And then I think it got more towards the 90s, and that's slightly diversified in terms of like different classes then entering into it. So it's like we're going through like different decades and different eras of like what is the norm, and we're really still going through a transition period of like people like I love the fact that now there exists a list of Black and brown owned comms agencies. Like imagine existing in the 90s as a list. Like it just wouldn't be a list.
No, it wouldn't.
It would be people who work at those companies.
Yeah.
I think and I think it's important that there's, there are Black owned things. So interesting to me. I was mentioning, being a member of the UK Black Comms Network, and mentioning that there was a membership fee, and somebody asked me like, oh, like how much do you pay for that? And I was like, oh, this much. And they were like, oh, that's actually quite a lot of money for a membership. And I was thinking,
No, it's not.
But firstly, no, it's not, in comparison to like, if you compare it to like membership clubs like, Soho House, or
even compare it to the CIPR, compare it to their fees, or compare it to the PRCA. Like
it's so accessible. It's so accessible. But then I think what I also didn't say back to that person was like, for me, I would even be willing to, don't tell Cam this, but I would even be willing to spend more because it's something that's like by us, for us.
Yeah.
And there's huge power in that you're able to like compare. I totally appreciate that I'm going off on a tangent, but I just have
but you're absolutely correct.
I have to celebrate the fact that, I also had a moment in a lift when I was coming back from a UK Black Comms Network, and it was another industry person, but somebody who worked in a finance capacity. It was another person of colour, not from the Black community, but they asked me where I'd been, and I spoke about UK Black Comms Network and blah blah blah. And they were asking me like, oh, what's your opinion, or what's your perception of groups like that? Like, don't you just find it really divisive? And I thought that could be a perception of someone who hasn't experienced a space or hasn't gone to an event that was run by this group. But for me, the absolute like value and like what I've taken from it is what happens to have been a shorthand between global minority people that have had influential positions and control over what the industry does and looks like, and who owns agencies. There's been a shorthand between those people for so long in terms of, I'm going to hire in my own image, or, someone comes from the same school or class group or knows my friendship circle. So, that's a shorthand for me. This also creates a bit of a shorthand because, like, the whole purpose of this podcast, we're sharing experiences and seeing where there's connective tissue. And it's so interesting when that does happen. And it also means that I've now got access to an amazing network of informal mentors and people who I'm mentoring and making to feel more confident coming up in the industry. I had amazing phone conversation with someone who was making that transition, or had just made that transition from journalism to comms. And it's so funny that I've like taken a look back and I'm like, oh my God, yeah, I've got so much experience to share with you and so much advice, and here it is. And it's creating moments like that where you can share the wealth of your advice, experience, opportunities, and be a connective thing. So I think
Yeah.
on where I became aware of there being, not very
Bias.
much of not very
Yeah.
much of me, or more bias in the industry. I
Mm.
think like you've got to put it in context and be aware of like how this industry was constructed,
Mm.
especially if you're trying to do anything that improves or helps create equity or diversity in this space. Like you need to know the origins and how it was created to know what you're coming up against, because you've still got a lot of the old guard and a lot of people who maybe don't want to see that change or don't see value in it, because it's all
Yeah.
about, just taking care of getting new clients. I don't even want to have to think about this whole diversity thing. But I think the bias is definitely in that whole like shorthand, hiring your own image, and in a lot of places like being the only. And
Yeah.
when I came to Creative Access, it was so interesting that I was talking to people about my experience of the fact that I've only ever in my 13-year comms career had two Black bosses, both female.
Wow.
Um, one was I say bosses, one was actually a boss in agency land and has been the only Black boss that I've had agency land, and one was a client. So, still
Okay.
kind of a boss, still,
Yeah.
still
Yeah.
something more
Yeah.
senior. In 13 years, those were the
Well,
only two occasions.
I could probably, well, I could top that because mine's been 20 years, 20 odd years. And I never had any Black bosses in my time. And now I'm independent, so I'm my own boss. But yeah,
And
during that time, absolutely not.
it's important.
It is important to see someone who looks like you that you can look at and think, oh my God, yeah, but no, I didn't have that coming up at all. So I'm really happy for those coming to the industry now that they can see that. That's really, really important. And as we talk about biases, we cannot talk about biases without mentioning the ethnicity pay gap. I mean, that's also where you see the big differences, So what are your thoughts around that? I know the PRCA raise and ethnicity equity board
Mm.
report on that. So what are your thoughts around the kind of ethnicity pay gap, and do you see that improving over time, you reckon?
And what have their conclusions been? Have their conclusions been that there's a gap in people doing the same work but not
Yeah,
being paid the same thing?
yeah,
So, oh God, this is a biggie, isn't it? And it's not
yeah.
just exclusive to comms, it's also within a lot of other like adjacent
Industries, yeah,
yeah, and like especially within the creative industries as well,
yeah,
because um what the gap that we help fill as Creative Access, and as a lot of others that are in like the DE&I space do. I think there's, shout out to lots of others doing a lot of amazing work, like Elizabeth Bananuka, who heads
yeah,
up, BMEPR Pros and the exec program,
yeah.
uh,
The blueprint.
Project 23, yeah, the blueprint, and,
Mhm,
Project 23. Um, there's loads of people doing like really great things.
mhm,
But one thing that's been really huge has been um, there's so much about how you navigate being remunerated and this perceived meritocracy, which kind of doesn't really exist, or how you negotiate salary increases or how you negotiate promotions that is unspoken
mm,
or that is assumed. And I always talk about like one specific example of like two people that I had on my team. One was from a Black background and didn't have any family members or friends of family members who worked in public relations and comms. And there
mhm,
was another person on my team who was, similar age, but had direct family members who were involved in like PR and comms organizations, and was from a white background. Um, and instantaneously, there's going to be lingo, there's going to be intel about how these how the business workings work
mhm,
uh, within, if we're talking agency or if we're talking brand.
mhm.
Um, that is going to be shared over here with this individual, that this person's going to maybe have to work out on their own, and it might take longer for that person to do that. So wherever it's possible for me to, I will like pull back that veil and be like, look, when you're in that negotiation situation, or if you're talking about like salary or promotion or, you know, remuneration for your work, these are the things that I would consider going into that conversation, and the evidence that I would have, and like this is the lingo, and this is like your value that you need to be aware of, and all that sort of stuff. So I think it's a wider issue around gatekeeping of stuff. If people don't have mentors, whether informal or formal, I think that can be a disadvantage, because you need someone to pass down the intel of like how things work. Because no one's going to tell you that, because it doesn't advantage the organization. It doesn't advantage the organization to tell you, you know, salary bands are kind of made up and bullshit. And you know, you need to
push for what you want. You got to fight for what you want, but they're not going to tell you that. And this is what also winds me up, because it's just like, well, actually, what happened to just decency and treating people right? Because if you've got the same person in front of you, we see it with even the housing market, all different markets, where they do the experiments and they'll hear a black voice and they'll think, okay, right, no, the property's not available. White voice, oh yeah, white name, white looking name. You know, we've seen it all, and it's all the systems of oppression that help to keep these things going. But like you say, with the gap, you've got those who have to obviously self-educate and try and make sure they're going for it. But then you've got the other side, which is the employers that shouldn't be doing these things in the first place. It's like, you know, you do not get to say, I'm going to offer Claire this amount of money, but Ebony comes along and let's offer her less because she's of color. Like, these are just things that should just not be happening. Obviously, we have to deal with it. This is why we have a pay gap even report. Do you know what I mean? But it's just frustrating. I find it, you know, just listening to people's stories and hearing where they've had to go back in and negotiate and try and ask for more. And it's like, well, what they've gotten, when you compare it to the white counterpart, still wasn't even right. I remember doing an interview with Cam, if you go back to one of my first episodes, and she spoke about that, about somebody getting a massive increase and, you know, her doing the role and then them trying to undercut her. And it happens to many people in the industry. But I'm glad that the PRCA and Reeb are actually spotlighting this. So moving forward slightly, what are your thoughts on allyship? And, you know, what does it mean for you? Like, what to you is like a good example of allyship?
I mean, for me, a great example of allyship is the fact that of all the comms jobs I've ever had, it's been an old boss or an old colleague or someone reaching back out to me saying, you know, we're looking, bar one job. That's how I've got most of my roles.
Oh, wow.
So, and, you know, it's part of like me doing a good job and being, you know, and working hard, but it's also about being an absolutely nosy, you know, B word and like network, and just realizing the value like early on, like of networking. Maybe that was like some of the practice. It's probably come from a little bit from my parents. It's probably come from a little bit of like journalism background and being totally unafraid of like anyone that you're, or at least like telling yourself, don't be afraid of any situation or person or environment that you're in. Like, you belong in every room. And I have to, do you know what? I have to give props to my mum for doing that, because she would drag us to anywhere and everywhere, whether it was like both my parents, to be fair, actually, but like museums, Bond Street, you know, hotels, and you know, all that thing that seems really meaningless and frivolous, but that's such an important feeling and confidence for someone to instill in you, that you belong anywhere you want to belong. And like, yeah, sometimes you still feel scared, but you do it anyway. But I think in this situation where it's thinking about allyship, belonging is a huge one, like first and foremost, and feeling comfortable. But I think where I've experienced really great allyship has been in me putting in the work to form friendships and form connections and like prove my connections so that they become strong foundations with influential people in the business, and cottoning on early on that, yeah, it's important for you to have people to compare notes with at peer level and also outside the organization, but also people who are like a few rungs above you on the ladder.
Mm-hmm.
And that is my one thing that I would pass on to anyone that I'm talking to, is like, don't feel like you have to stop at peer level with relationships or friendships or connections. Like, there's so much power and value in you making connections to people who are in the decision making positions.
Mm-hmm.
And I refer back to that, that phone call example of a previous boss who was a board member, literally checking in on me because it was not just the right thing to do, but he could also put himself in my shoes.
Mm.
And that's all it is, really. Like, it's just about like trying to strip away the biases, which we all have, and realizing the value in having and nurturing diverse workforces, and also like ingraining it in your mind that stopping at hiring someone of color, or stopping at hiring someone who is other or from the global majority, is not the final, thing for you to tick off on your allyship list. It does not stop there.
Yeah.
It then becomes about you understanding that they're probably going to be feeling like they potentially don't belong, or there's a lack of belonging, or it's that intersectionality of like, I already don't feel like I can, if it's someone that's been brought in at like junior or mid-level, it's already someone feeling like, I feel really powerless because I'm one of the least influential people at this organization. I'm also quite alone here because nobody else looks like me, or there's very few people who look like me, or the people who do look like me get grouped together. So that's a lot of pressure. I don't feel like I can, advocate for myself or speak up if I experience a microaggression, or, put my hand up for all of the opportunities potentially. It could be, a hindrance if that person, if there's not the allyship consideration around that person beyond the hiring. Like, that's not your job done. It's also about, how do you then help that person thrive? What's going to help them?
Yeah. No, I get that. And thank you for that. I think that's really helpful. And what would you say motivates or inspires you to keep going in your career? And what would you say you found the most challenging so far in your journey? So your motivations and your challenges.
Motivations, I would talk about from an environmental perspective, as in like a team and working environment. I've worked in incredibly toxic environments where I've experienced bullying from bosses. I've experienced massive over-servicing, and then it being painted as though that's my fault. At like more than one agency. So it's not just a unique problem, it's an industry-wide problem.
Yeah.
Because of the model. And because of that learning, I do everything in my power to make sure that the team that I have does not experience that.
Yeah.
And that they experience me championing them, and that I know I'm going to get way more out of them if I suggest awards that they should go for, and tell them to network, and I'm transparent with like some things that aren't explained about like how to progress, or important things to know. So I think that's been a good thing. Like, out of that crappy stuff has been that good stuff. So maybe that's the whole answer, I guess.
Yeah, well, that's a good one though, because you've used the sour experiences that you've had and helped to motivate you and your team. I think that's really nice. That is good. So with that in mind, actually, as you mentioned, things that you've experienced, what is it that you look for from your employer? Like, what to you makes a good working environment?
One thing that I've had to relearn is not to be a toxic positivity person, or like toxic silver lining person. And I still do it. I still do it all the time. Like, there might be a problem that comes up, and I'm like, well, at least blah blah blah, or it's not so bad. And like, I feel like that's it's instant response of a comms person because you are by your nature a problem solver.
Exactly
And
that.
you've got to be solutions orientated. So I think that is a good thing. But then I think like the issue that can then maybe come with like toxic positivity or toxic silver linings in, you know, syndrome or whatever the hell you want to call it, is then minimizing stuff or like minimizing experience or not believing stuff when it's brought to you, washing over stuff, just, you know, blind direction. But there's huge power in bosses knowing that, to go back to my previous point, if you bring someone in who's from the global majority, realizing that your work doesn't stop there in terms of helping them thrive. And that, you know, that goes for your whole workforce. There's loads of things that you can do to help your team thrive, but there's that person already, you know, probably feels quite othered. And I think more broadly, it's about creating environments where, and this was a bias that I had to get over, creating environments where there's not one perceived ideal. There's not one like central normal. I mean that in terms of personality. So like not thinking that as a successful comms person, you have to be outgoing and talkative and have a certain kind of accent and have a certain kind of way of presenting yourself, because I think that's all like quite toxic things that have been impressed upon me from being in this industry so long. So it's about like stripping away some of that bias that probably a lot of people from the global majority have absorbed themselves. And then once you become aware of that, I feel like your approach changes, your approach to hiring changes, your approach to like, you know, what different people need in order to help them thrive changes. Yeah, that's definitely what I would say about like what switches things up from old school mentality to helping people win now.
Okay, I think that's helpful. And what would you say, what does sort of like, you know, a real diverse, or I'd say, or equitable environment look like for you? Because, you know, people are always going about, obviously, you're working for a DEI kind of organization anyway. So what does diversity, equity, and inclusion look like in the workplace to you?
So I mean, there's always that analogy. I'm going to like totally butcher that analogy, but like I think it's something like diversity is, you know, inviting someone to the party, and inclusion is like encouraging them to dance or telling them that they can dance. But then I think the equity bit is not be, do you know what? I think a lot of trappings are people being afraid to offend. But I think as long as you're approaching things from a position of empathy, yeah, you might make mistakes. I still make mistakes. I always remind people I'm not a diversity, equity, and inclusion expert first. I work for an organization that's purpose-led, and we happen to be centered around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I've had to become more adept at speaking that language and walking that talk. And I've been on loads of trainings. But first and foremost, I'm a comms and marketing pro. That is my profession. That's what I'm good at. But I just so happen to work for a company that is purpose-led. But I think it's my main advice around creating equitable environments is like, things are going to be a bit uncomfortable because like we're going from spin doctor, daddy owned agencies, people emergencing, people emerge, you know, other people starting to emerge in the 90s. And only just now we're like just starting to be part of panels or in rooms or industry events where people are actually comfortable with having conversations about inequity in terms of race or class or gender in the workplace. Like only really now are we starting to be comfortable, or for that to be normal, for that to be a topic for us to talk about industry events. So I think I would just remind people that like it's okay to get stuff wrong. If you've really messed up, you just, you know, you apologize whoever needs to be apologized to, and you move on from it and you learn from it. But there's huge advantage to your bottom line. There's huge advantage to your overall output. And it makes the work better,
Yeah.
really and truly. We
Yeah.
know that. I always refer back to McKinsey statistics around, more diverse workforces being more productive and more profitable.
Profitable, yeah.
Like
It does
inarguably,
impact your bottom line, and that has been shown in lots of studies. So
yeah,
I completely
like
agree with you.
there's business benefits, but also like the output's going to be better. Like I refer back to the example of, the Heinz advert, or
Yes.
other things where people have maybe slightly not got the mark right. And I think there were really good reflections on that, in that if you bring in, like, say you've got a creative team, you bring in one person of color, depending on that person's level of seniority or time in the business, that person may not be confident enough,
And
or
also their experience. Because if you bring in,
exactly.
Badenoch into a campaign, she might look at that and see no
Oh,
problem with it. So it also depends on
absolutely.
experience too.
Absolutely. Because, again, reinforcing Black people are not a monolith. We don't all think the
That.
same.
Yeah.
But if you introduce more diversity into those decision-making rooms, it's going to make for so much better output, TV that
Exactly.
people want to watch, advertising that really actually cuts through to
Hmm.
culture and how your brand exists in people's cultures. Like, yeah, but you're
Yeah.
only going to do that if you lead with empathy. You're comfortable with being uncomfortable, and
Yeah.
you acknowledge the fact that the diversity, equity, and inclusion mindset, because it's not something to tick off, it's a way of approaching things, doesn't stop when you hire someone of color.
Exactly that. Exactly that. No, I agree. I agree. No, thank you for sharing that. So moving into your proudest moments. So what would you say has been your proudest moment? It could be work, could be a personal, and maybe you can give us a career highlight of yours.
Do you know what? I'm a through and through comms person. The thing that brings me the most joy and pride is when I get really good coverage.
Yeah.
So like, yeah, absolutely that. But I think even more so than that is maintaining connections and networks with amazing comms pros across the years. Like that is hugely valuable. And I really, when I was moving into an in-house role, which this is, that was of huge value to me.
Mm.
Because when you are in-house and you're representing comms at the most senior level, it becomes quite lonely when
Mm.
you start to build campaigns, or you start to doubt yourself. You start to doubt yourself, or doubt your source, or you just don't have as many peers as you did, back in
Yeah.
agency land to check stuff with. Like that is my hugest that's my, not my hugest achievement, but a huge thing of value in my life, like maintaining and cultivating those connections, and like having those WhatsApp groups that I can ping, like my old Ketchum peeps or whatever it is, where I can, say, can we have like a quick half-hour brainstorm this morning? Like I've got these ideas, I just want to run them by you. Like I'm
Mm.
sure that you guys can expand these out for me and like make them even better. Um, like, no person is an island, and there are no new ideas. Like that's a huge thing
Mm.
of value, and you're measured on your output. So that's massive. But I guess, I don't know, achievements. I guess like having a slash career and being in an environment and a team that has been like the sum of the parts. Like I love my team. I think they're in my little comms, squad. I've got, a couple of Gen Zs that I manage, but they are, not the cookie cutter perception of what people assume that Gen Zs are. They're so conscientious and hardworking and ideas people, they're doers. And we've got a really positive workforce. And I think I probably didn't know, from having existed in um, agency land for so long, um, that it was possible to have like a non-toxic way of operating and moving through the world, and managing like the greater business at large.
Yeah.
That's been a really beautiful thing. And like finally, I would also just say, like, when I've received the gongs, man, like when I've been on, like, I had the huge privilege of being on one of the Haymarket Award judging panels last year for
The PR Week Purpose Awards.
oh yeah, no, it was that. Yeah, so it's receiving recognition that I'm able to sit on a judging panel like that and being part of, and having the true privilege of like getting to see all of these amazing campaigns and work that people are submitting for the Campaign Purpose Awards. And a huge triumph of mine was also being nominated for a campaign for an old client of mine, like good old fashioned like comms and marketing. It was a pivot that I had to do for a client, Adobe, like back in lockdown, when it was all going to be about events, and then lockdown happened, and then I had to pivot, and we had to come up with an idea that was all about being virtual and like bringing people together. And it was so successful that it got nominated for an award, an industry award, and also got commissioned for another season. And it was a series called The Debunk, and it was about bringing really high performing, intelligent, like comms and marketing people together in a room, and like basically having a big old debate.
Yeah.
And loads of other kind of like marketing materials around it. And it ended up being a huge source of marketing traffic and business traffic for that particular part or section of Adobe. And it's just like recognition is important.
Yeah.
And that was a huge one for me that I won't forget. And also meant that I learned new skills when I had to. I became a producer in lockdown, which was amazing.
Yeah, that's good. That's really nice. That's nice. So talking about the industry in terms of future, what do you think about how the industry will evolve over the next few years? Because you've got all this AI stuff going on, there's lots happening. What are your thoughts around that?
I'm really excited for more people of color to be involved with creating and being in the decision-making rooms for solutions that are AI driven. One such example of that is, my mentor, who I'm connected to, and I'm so in awe of. Like, she's a senior, highly experienced Black woman in comms, Effie Kanua.
And she's lovely.
She's created her own,
her own AI. I know.
Yeah, investing
it's
her
so
own
good. Like, is it called Lila, isn't it?
It's called Lila. Yeah, Lila. But it's like she's invested her own capital in it. It was years in the making, and everything that like DeepMind is doing as well, about trying to get more diverse voices and diverse talent in the creation rooms of AI, because I think that's hugely important. And there's a brilliant podcast called The Good Robot by Dr. Lucy McInerney. I think she's a professor at Cambridge, and she explores whether technology is inherently good or bad, and also explores it with the lens of feminism. And I think what's really interesting is understanding and really dissecting how important it is to have diverse voices in those decision-making rooms. Like, if anyone listens to any other podcast, like, that's a really, really good one, because it just opens your mind to how important that is. And
it's so important. I've met quite a few like designers, and I've come across, I remember speaking to one in particular, and she was working for quite a well-known brand, and she was talking about how they did not take into consideration anything through diversity. And so for that, the auto movement of this product didn't recognize any Black people whatsoever. And it's just like, because they hadn't thought about that. And these are just things that I feel like are so important. So I agree with you in terms of making sure that there is involvement in terms of creation of where it goes. It's so important.
For this one, it was like focusing on, the beauty industry, and the beauty industry relying on age-old data that had been tested, where it was tested on ethnic minorities, was in really unethical environments, and was centuries old data that was still being relied upon. So it had all of those like trappings of black people have tougher skin, or
just lies. Yeah.
all these lies, and how dangerous that is when people aren't being held to account, or there's not diverse people in decision making rooms. And I think that there's also like a huge efficiency saving opportunity with AI in comms specifically. I've had this conversation time and time again. It always starts with, oh my God, it's terrifying, it's going to take our jobs. And it's like, use it, experiment with, get to know it.
I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying the ones that I have come into contact with. Like, it's been really, really helpful. But like you said, it just needs to be inclusive, So yeah, really
absolutely.
Cool. Okay, so what would you say are some key lessons that you've learned throughout your career? Maybe you can give, three key lessons that you've learned throughout your career.
Relationships are everything.
Yeah.
An extension of relationships are everything. Make sure that your whole professional world doesn't just extend to either within your business or within your agency. Have peers and professionals that you can compare notes with that don't have the trappings or are aware of the politics that are going on within like your world and your ecosystem. Because sometimes you can get really blinkered, and that can mean you not realizing that maybe your career is going in a direction that you didn't realize it could go in. And like going to industry events and networking and sometimes pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone is really important. Like being visible and like PRing yourself, advocating for yourself, especially if you want to stay within comms and you want to reach influential or leadership positions and you want to help bring others up. Being visible and being known for being great is really important, and a part of that is doing the work and being great and like shouting about that on all the various platforms that you can shout about it on, but also like physically like being and doing and going to those networking events, and realizing that these are all just people. Like sometimes you build folks up to exist on a pedestal. And then when you meet them in real life, it's kind of like, oh, like we're really similar, or we've got these connections, or we come from a similar background, or whatever that might be. But sometimes it helps to like break down the barriers or the limits that you might place on yourself, thinking that you're not worthy. Like I remember when I was a long while ago thinking about going freelance, and advice from a couple of different mentors, because I had all these preconceptions about like what are all these specific things that I need to get in place, and like I'm not exactly like that person. And they really got me to ask those introspective questions of like, what truly is it that separates you from these other people? And as soon as you examine that, you like break away a lot of the bias that sometimes you have, and the limitations that sometimes you place on yourself. So I'd say relationships, networks outside of your organization, and networking.
Yeah, in general. Okay, that was really helpful. Really, really good. And what advice would you give to young people of color in particular who are entering the industry?
I would say sometimes be excited. Like first of all, like I don't want to put a dampener or anything. Like I've had such amazing experiences where where like comms has allowed me to travel. It's allowed me to work on big budget campaigns, like taking influencers to Mobile World Congress in Barcelona, and taking part in like huge block long conferences in San Francisco and launches and all that sort of stuff. Like it's led to really, really exciting and things that I'm really proud of delivering. The other advice that I would extend to make the journey a little bit smoother, or just things to be mindful of, are referring back to those three things that I said were really, really vital to my career, and like how I've managed to get jobs or like learn important information about how to navigate this space sooner has been my network of people, network of advisors and friends and peers that I trust, and reaching out to those people and also being generous to give to those people. I think if it's like a PR-led comms individual coming into this space, your relationships with journos are absolutely everything. Cultivate them at every single level in your career, because you never know where you're going to go, how influential those journalists are going to become. And just always be a nice bloody person. Your reputation is everything. And another one is length of time in a role. Like sometimes it really doesn't work, or it's really not a good fit, like both ways. And maybe it's like really toxic and it's not great for your mental health. So in those scenarios, yeah, maybe, take a hard look and maybe move on. But try and move on when there's something else in your grasp.
Yeah.
And typically try and get at least a year or two under your belt at any organization, because that, to your future employer or your future manager or recruiter, is enough time for you to have got under the skin of the business or the clients, and also to have, if affected some, like injected some kind of value, or delivered something. So I think that's also a really important one as well.
Yeah, absolutely agree on that one. And we kind of touched this a little bit earlier, but where do you go for industry/peer support? I know you mentioned UK Black Comms Networks, for which we're both members, and I think it's a really valuable resource, and I would encourage others to definitely join. Is there anything else that you are go for support?
Yeah. Do you know what? My dad is always my marker of like he's had to navigate a lot in his life. He originally trained as a draftsman, and then he cottoned on to the fact that industry was depleting, joined a software company, became a director at that software company, was afforded shares there. Like,
Amazing.
he absolutely grafted. And so he is I always want to make him proud, and I always want his approval, which sometimes can be a little bit difficult when I feel like I don't have his approval. But I know that's cliche and that's not helpful to other people who might not have a line into my dad. But I guess it's just also like trusting the wisdom of your family. Like, don't overlook that, and the fact that they will always have, hopefully will always have your back, whether it's your chosen family or your immediate family. But in a more practical sense, it is the WhatsApp groups. So, and
mentoring, didn't you? You mentioned mentoring, didn't you? So you've done the BME PR Pros. I know that there's the PRCA have a new mentoring scheme, which is PRISM, Public Relations, Inclusion Support and Mentoring. Yes. So that's opened up recently.
And also creative access at different points in the year. It rotates around different sectors, but we do offer mentor matching schemes. So the most important thing that I always say to people in terms of how they become aware of those things is like registering with us. Like, it takes a bit of time. You have to plug in all of your like demographics, but we need that so that we can advocate for people who need to be advocated for.
Right.
So do that, and then every week you get opportunities in your inbox, plus following us on social media. But that's just another route. But yes, definitely. I'm so not a gatekeeper of other organizations. Like, wherever you can get your entrance point into, like whether it's Taylor Bennett or Brixton Finishing School or ERICAP or whatever, like those are all great places to find roles. But in terms of mentor matching, there are only really a few organizations that do that. But yeah, definitely BME PR Pros and everything that Elizabeth Bananuka is doing is great. And then some WhatsApp groups that you can join yourself are places like Common People. That's specifically for people who come from working class backgrounds and who work across the creative industry. So it's a very noisy group, but it's like people have each other's backs. And I've gone there for like venue recommendations or sharing stuff from work or comparing notes with people. There's also the advisory group, which was set up by an ex-Ketchum boss called David Gallagher. And that has got a multitude of subgroups depending on what you're interested in. It's got one for women, it's got one for AI, it's got one for being in-house, so on and so forth. So you can choose which ones you join. Just, message David Gallagher on LinkedIn, and I'm sure he'll hook you up with them. But yeah, forge WhatsApp groups with your peers as well, because that's often.
That's a good idea. Forging a WhatsApp group with your peers is also a good idea. Okay, so moving into the last section, which is mindset, which is my favorite section because I'm all about sort of personal development. I love all that sort of stuff. So how do you deal with the internal mind war that everybody deals with? So essentially, how do you deal with self-limiting beliefs?
Big believer in therapy. If you can get access to it, do it. Both times I accessed it through NHS. So if that's something that you need and you feel like it's going to give you tools to make you more resilient on your own, do it.
I agree with that. I recommend therapy, absolutely. Yeah.
Plus, other things that have spilled out from that, which are, I have my mantras that I have pinned up on my bedroom wall that I see every single morning when I wake up. And for me, words hold a lot of power because of like the career that I've chosen. So that's just something that really, really works for me. I've got like 3 phrases that I see every morning and it just helps me. And I would also like realizing that it's PR, not ER. Yeah. Like we're not like cure. I mean, some people who work in healthcare comms, they're helping to cure cancer. But like ultimately we are not saving lives, and nobody's gonna die if not everything gets ticked off. Make sure the essentials get ticked off and you do them really well, and that all of that is visible, and you loudly celebrate your wins and celebrate the wins of your team, because no one else is going to do it for you. But yeah, realizing that it's not PR. Yes, it's PR, not ER. And use it or lose it with holiday. Don't let that slip away. Take the time out that you need to, because you can't pour from an empty cup. I know that sounds like a huge cliche, but I've experienced the negative side of that, and the negative side of burnout and over-indexing and not leaving the office before 7 p.m. and all of that rubbish stuff. So case in point, this week I've taken a week off literally just to be. Everyone was like, what are you doing? And I'm just like, arty things and unplugging.
Yeah, that's important to do. That is so important to do, and you're quite right. And for those who are in employed roles, definitely take time. And for those who are self-employed like me, also need to take to building the time, because actually sometimes we will just keep going and going and going. And
what
so
for you? I want to know how you would answer that question, Ebony.
For me, self-limiting beliefs, again, I say for me, I do have different mantras that I do, but it's also about recognizing that negative voice and understanding. For me, I would say it's about understanding that the majority of our thoughts are negative. Therefore, we have to work slightly harder to quell those thoughts. And so with that, and I also have that question where I'm like, okay, is this coming from a high vibration Ebony or this low vibration Ebony? And those are things that I have to set myself up with sometimes, because sometimes you have your voices that come in your mind, yourself. You talk to yourself and you'll be like, can I do that? Oh, I don't think I can do that today. Or I don't know if I can do that. But then you have to remind yourself and reaffirm by going back over yourself and saying, actually, I've done that in the past. I've done that in the past. And I've done that in the past. Of course I can do that. So it's almost like self-coaching is what I kind of do, I say. 100%. But yeah, I feel like when it comes to self-limiting beliefs, I like to say, and what I also recognize is that we are self-imposing them. They are self-limiting beliefs. We are putting them on ourselves. And we have to recognize that and break away from that. And I think that's the bit that helps me, when those sort of things come in my mind. I'm like, okay, well, no, I can do this. And I've always been kind of very go-gettery and determined. So, if it comes in my mind, I will be like, okay, let's look for something that can actually go against that to prove myself wrong. Find your own evidence to prove yourself wrong. And you usually can. Just looking at your own history and be like, oh, I did that. I did do that. What am I talking about? Shut up. It's fine. Keep it moving. Do you know what I mean? So That's where I kind of come from in that way.
That's a really good mantra, and that is actually, it's not one of my 3 ones that I've got on my wall, but I get told that every Monday. There's a class that I go to every Monday evening without fail.
Yeah.
And the instructor always says at the end of the class, you can do hard things.
Yeah.
And that is such a powerful one, because it's like, yeah, you've been through like cruddy things before, and you're still here.
Exactly that.
And it's made you stronger.
Exactly.
And it's like, there's a really cliche thing that really helped me. Somebody gave me a book. It's Don't Judge Me. It's by the Dalai Lama.
That's
but
fine.
I read it at a time.
Okay.
In my 20s, when I really needed to hear it. It was like a horrible trifecta of like, work was really toxic, and a relationship that I was in was really toxic, and it was just not a very nice time. And one of the bits of advice was that you should be thankful for your enemies, and you should be thankful for the people that cause friction in your life, because they're helping you to polish yourself into this resilient person. And just think how not resilient you would be if you came up against no friction in your life whatsoever. So you should be thankful for them, and you should treat them as your teachers. And like that was a huge game changer for just reframing stuff.
Rather
than, as you say, spending time in that negative headspace. How can I flip this perspective?
Yeah, absolutely, I agree with you. And also with the experiences that you have, some of them are not nice, but they do shape you. And like you say, they build resilience. And you can look at it and be like, okay, well, I got over that hurdle. It happened, but I got over it. I got past it. I'm still here, still moving. So yeah, definitely. Okay, so looking back at your journey, would you do it all over again?
Yeah, there's definitely moments where I've fucked up.
Yeah.
Or
human, we all do.
Yeah. And sometimes it's like, I think also the more experience that you gain, the stakes get higher. And so when you do make a mistake, it can feel big, like it can feel large, and like reminding yourself that, as you said, you're human, you're going to continue to make mistakes, because we're not robots. And unfortunately, we exist in a service model, and that is about somebody buying your service as a human, and there will be errors. So as much as that, there've been triumphs, but there's also been really difficult things. And oh God, what was the question?
The question was about your journey. Would you do it all over again? But you said yes, you would. So there's been difficult things, but you've overcome them, right? And they help to shape your experiences on your journey.
Yeah, I think that's my bottom line is, I think every experience, whether difficult or easy, has been purposeful and has shaped you into being someone who's more informed, more experienced. And to quote Oprah, once you know more, you know more, you know better, you do better. And the greater wealth of experience and knowledge and things you go through, the more options you have. The stronger you feel. So I'd do it all again.
Well, that's good. We like to hear that. We do like to hear that. And this is also a question that makes you laugh. We'll come into our 2 last questions now. So what has been the best and the worst advice you've been given? Now, sometimes this can be funny, because some of the worst advices is just like, what? But what for you has been maybe your worst or your best advice? Give an example of one or both. If you had any, of course.
Yeah, I mean, going back to when I was still early on in my comms career, I was still networking with journalists, because I was still entertaining the idea that I might go back into journalism. And there was a senior journalist who at the time was at one big newspaper, and ended up going to another big newspaper. I can't name names because this is actually quite a dark thing that he said. It was actually not very nice. And it was someone's leaving drinks, and it was like a networking thing. And he said to me, if you want to get ahead in this industry, you'll like stay behind and like stay at this party. And all of the subcontext that you're taking with that comment is absolutely right. And not only was that terrible advice, because yes, I believe in the power of networking, but not
Yeah,
you
no, we're
know,
not going there. Yeah.
not there, but not only was it terrible advice, but it was also taking advantage of a position of power. It
Yeah.
was just so gross. And I think I have to always remind people that young people like absorb everything and they're really impressionable and they don't always feel like they can advocate for themselves. So yeah, not only was that creepy, weird, awful, I still remember it to this day, but um it was just wrong. Like that's not how
Yeah.
you network. You don't
No, that was
network.
really bad advice. That was
Uh,
really, really bad advice. What about the best advice you've been given, would you
Best
say?
advice that I've ever received is, again, such a cliche, work smarter, not harder.
Yeah.
So don't overpromise and underdeliver. Again, something that as an inherent people pleaser, I still am in the process of learning all the time. Um, but that's a huge one. Like you live and die on your reputation and you're only as good as your last piece of work.
Mm.
So yeah, under promising and over delivering is the most powerful thing, and being your cheerleader, PRing yourself and your wins and the wins of your team is hugely powerful. So yeah, definitely that piece of advice, like working smarter, not harder,
Yeah.
is
I love
huge.
that. That's my favorite. I always say work smarter, not harder. So yeah, I do feel like that was that's good advice. That's definitely good advice. Now, do you have any rules that you've implemented to help you along your journey?
I think the first one that was since starting out, one of my mantras was always, "You've got nothing to lose," and
Mm.
that I applied to networking scenarios, going up to people who were decision makers or smart people, and being unafraid to and telling them, who I am, or just networking, because it 9 times out of 10 probably nothing comes from that, but maybe there's the one scenario where you impress that person, or you never know who that person could connect you to. And I say the same to my team. I'm always they're great networkers anyway, but I'm always sort of like hyping them up and talking about all of their great projects and things that they're doing extracurricularly to clients and everyone that we come into contact with, because you just never know who is going to be of you know a connector for you. So that was one,
It's a
as
good,
in you've got nothing to lose.
yeah.
But then one that was, I think, quite a recent one was, it's difficult to capture this, but it's basically don't be so limited in your idea of what your journey should look like. Like you can really do yourself a disservice if you're shoulding over everything, you know,
Mm.
and you're just, as a result of that, not being present, or you are completely dismissing certain sectors that might be open to you career wise if you've got a really fixed vision of where you think you should go.
Mm.
So for me, it's about being open. And in fact, that was born from a discussion with Zarina Charles, where she was getting me to ask all these questions. And, I had this very fixed view of like how my career should go. And I think that's good. I think it's good to have markers of success. I think that's
Mm.
great, because otherwise you're just heads down, blinkered, and you don't really come up for air and you don't celebrate the wins. Um, but the key thing being, don't close off any avenues or opportunities because you've decided that either you're not experienced enough, or um you don't look like all the people who've done that thing before you, whether it's like a slot on a influential industry group, or it's a certain career avenue that someone's got in contact with you about, or it's someone getting in contact with you saying, offering you a lecturing position or whatever it is. Like, not closing yourself off, and being the person to say no. um let other people say no, don't you say no to yourself, and that
Mm.
is something I'm still learning.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a good one. That's a really good one. That's really, really good one. I appreciate you sharing that one. And that was our last question. So thank you so much. I think it's been really nice having this chat with you for sure. But thank you so much, Ella, for coming on and sharing your story with us. It's been really, really interesting hearing from you and hearing about your own lived experience. And if anyone wants to contact you, how can they contact you? Tell them where to find you.
Yeah, I mean, Ella Darlington on LinkedIn is the primary one, or Ella Darlington on Twitter as well. And Creative Access is where I work. So if either you or someone that you know would benefit from being connected to amazing organizations in the creative industries, and that encompasses all the various different things, not just comms, it also extends to like TV, theatre, film, publishing, so on and so forth. Encourage them to sign up with us.
Thank you for joining me today. And that has been a great chat. So I have enjoyed speaking with Ella Darlington. Like she said, if you want to connect with her, you can find her on LinkedIn. Well, thank you all for tuning in to this episode. I will be back very soon with some more wonderful people from the world of comms. Until then, stay blessed, everybody, and we'll catch up with you soon. Thank you for tuning in.